Well, 1967, Jim Morrison and the Doors there with 20th Century Fox. And we're listening to the Doors for a particular reason, and that's because of some digging I've been doing around something called the USS Liberty. And I'll explain how that relates to Jim Morrison in a minute. But, Martin, what was this? It was 1967. It was during the Arab-Israeli War. What happened with the USS Liberty? I know it was a US ship. It was listening to communications that were going on during that Arab-Israeli War in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was attacked, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's basically a spy ship. It was in the Eastern Mediterranean, sort of listening to communications as the Arab-Israeli War was kicking off, and it was attacked by the Israeli Defence Forces, leading to the deaths of a considerable number of people on board the ship. It was subsequently covered up, although not completely. Obviously, when lots of people have been killed, it's quite hard to cover it up completely. The Israelis pretended it was an accident, but most independent investigations, and there was a BBC Two documentary about it, I believe, showed that the Israelis had done it deliberately. They were pretending to be Egyptians. They weren't wearing any distinguishing markings and so on. So they hoped that the Americans, in responding to the Egyptian attack on their spy boat, would then join in the war on the side of the Israelis.
And did they?
No, they didn't. But on the other hand, they didn't do anything about it either.
But I mean,
they basically sucked it up, even though the Israelis had attacked their ship and killed a large number of their personnel.
Okay, so how do you go about convincing the US Navy that you're actually an Egyptian attacking a ship rather than an Israeli? Surely they can see the planes flying past.
This is what's the giveaway: is the actual there were various units used to attack the ship, and none of them were carrying any distinguishing marks. They certainly weren't carrying Israeli distinguishing marks. But it soon became apparent that it was in fact the Israelis attacking the ship, and this is part of. I mean, the Lavon affair in the 1950s. Lots of bombs went off in Cairo and around Egypt, blamed on Islamic extremists, but in actual fact the Egyptian police captured the people concerned. They were Israelis pretending to be Islamic extremists in order to undermine the Egyptian government. So the Israelis have got a long track record of this kind of tricksy behaviour.
Now, just looking at the casualties on the USS Liberty, 34 crew members were killed, naval officers, seamen, 2 Marines and a civilian, and 171 were wounded. So now, at the time, the US Navy identified the attackers as Israelis. I mean, how can they be in the situation where they're prepared to accept that sort of attack with so many of their members of their forces killed, and a ship basically wrecked by motor torpedo boats and fighter aircraft without any kind of retaliation? In fact, without even a statement to the public and the rest of the world. Well,
because the Israelis have a lock. An arm lock on US policy. They had an arm lock on US policy in 1967, and they got an arm lock on US policy today. Effectively, Johnson, who was the president at the time, said, we're not going to do anything about this, we're just going to suck it up. Although, in actual fact, as you're now going to tell us, elements within the US Navy were not happy about this at all.
Well, that's right. In 2009, on the Daily Telegraph's Silurian column, I think it's one of these anonymous columns that the Telegraph do, Silurian says that, interestingly, the Rear Admiral commanding the nearest US Navy carrier task force to the Liberty ordered American fighter planes, which were only 15 minutes away, to fly to the defence of the Liberty. However, his order was countermanded by the commander of US naval forces in Europe. The carrier admiral who ordered the strike, a retaliatory strike against Israel, was George S. Morrison, the father of rock legend Jim Morrison. The admiral who countermanded the order, however, was John S. McCain Jr., the father of 2008 Republican US presidential candidate John McCain III. So this is fascinating. You've got within the Navy, and also the President Lyndon Johnson in charge at the time, you've got a real struggle there going on within the top of the US Navy. Various characters, Jim Morrison's father and John McCain's father, both at loggerheads over whether to retaliate or not.
Well, yes, and I think this is very indicative of what goes on. We've got a situation where quite frequently terrorist attacks are not what they appear, of one kind and another. And it's a devil to work out what is actually going on. and people are trying to. There is an attempt to manipulate public opinion and also military operations through these kind of false flag attacks. And of course, we've heard a lot more about false flag attacks since the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta in Damascus this time last year, because it's pretty clear through various investigations that have been carried out, including by Seymour Hersh, who's a very senior US journalist, and others, that this was actually carried out by the rebels in order to create an anti-Assad wave which would lead to outside intervention, possibly working with intelligence services in Turkey and maybe Britain and the US also.
We're going back to the USS Liberty incident in June 1967. Rear Admiral Morrison was fiercely opposed the official report on the USS Liberty incident, which exonerated Israel of any wrongdoing, and though he was at the time of the incident the youngest admiral in the US Navy, he never rose to higher rank. So that was 1967. Jim Morrison himself died in mysterious circumstances in Paris in 1971, Martin. Now, there is all sorts of discussion quite over the last 3 or 4 years. I think it was 2009. There was an interesting article published saying, well, basically, Jim Morrison's body had been moved. His admiral father was told that he died of a heart attack in a hospital, but if all the official records of anyone who was there said that Morrison was never taken to hospital.
Well, indeed. And, of course, the conspiracy theories are being spun around exactly this topic. But you've got to remember that during that period there was something being run in the US called COINTELPRO, counterintelligence propaganda, by the FBI. And if anybody wants to look up what went on, they just had to put in COINTELPRO into their search engine. They were, in fact, engaged in dirty tricks to discredit opponents of the US policy. And, the Fred Hampton, who was the Black Panther leader, he was assassinated. Others were addicted to drugs. Some were, their personalities were changed in various ways.
Well, the other strange thing about Morrison's death, of course, is that he was supposed to have died of a heroin overdose, but he had a hatred and fear of needles, and he said he would never have anything to do with heroin.
Indeed, he was a boozer. That's what most people would have said of him. He was a boozer, not a heroin addict.
OK, so anyway, today it's the 4th of July. US Independence Day. So as a little tribute to that, somebody else who there are suspicions about whether they were killed as part of this COINTELPRO program was Jimi Hendrix, rock legend. So let's have his version of the Stars and Stripes.